Welcome to Rapid Fire Wednesdays, Q&A for corporate immigration professionals. I'm Kimberley Best Robidoux in San Diego with a partner with WR Immigration. And I'm joined as always with Miki Matrician, who's the co-managing partner of our Boston office. Hi to you, Miki.
Hi, Kimberly.
So I know for today's installment of our Rapid Fire Wednesday, we're discussing the election and the impact to immigration programs. So it's kind of a heavy topic for us. And we had talked about the what ifs back in June and then again in August. And now we have the what now, what next. So we do know that there has been a result in the election and it will be a Trump 2.0 administration. So we're going to talk a little bit about what our global mobility professionals and immigration professionals can expect, what to visualize for their programs, their organizations. And we're going to do it at a very high level today. And then going forward in the coming weeks, we'll dig in a little bit deeper on the various programs. So to get us started, Miki, can you talk about, what were the policies from the prior Trump administration?
Yes. The general tenor of the administration last time around and the general policies really was about restricting immigration overall, including employment-based immigration. And so what that did was create a huge spike in requests for evidence, denials of petitions, even those types that, typically would have been thought to be straightforward. And part of this approach and this policy ended up being the repeal of the policy that was known as the deference policy, which meant that petitions that were previously approved for an extension, previous approvals would be afforded deference so that it wouldn't be a high level of scrutiny applied to extension cases, for example. Those types of policies were rescinded under the last Trump administration and resulted in an uptick in requests for evidence and denial. So that's sort of one of the first things that comes to mind for me in terms of work-based immigration.
Right. So, what we saw was discouraging companies from hiring foreign workers in the prior administration. And then, on the humanitarian side of immigration, what we have heard, during the election cycle is that Trump plans to bring forth the largest deportation operation in U.S. history. So that's been a huge talk of the election, and we'll see how that plays out. There isn't a lot of space in detention facilities right now, so that could result in mass deportation camps, significant amount of money to move forward with a large deportation effort like that. But we can also see, or will expect to see, a repeal of some of the humanitarian-based immigration relief programs like temporary protected status for many countries, which have been expanded under the Biden administration. And then there might also be restrictions on some of the visas, such as TNU for victims of crimes. And then we might also see, DACA eliminated, as well as a dismantling of the family unity parole program that was just put into place recently. So what about, on the employment side of things?
Yeah, I think in general, we're worried about, benefits that were extended via executive order, but also at risk could be benefits that were implemented via regulation. So, we don't know anything about this yet, but we are a little bit concerned about STEM OPT and H4 EADs that were implemented via regulation. My guess would be it would have to go through the regulatory process again to dismantle those programs, but those are two examples of things that we're kind of concerned about and watching for. And then, employment-based immigration typically has had support from both sides of the aisle, but as I said, bottlenecking case processing due to increased requests for evidence is something that we would expect. And then, for things like H-1B, the Trump administration last time around had rolled out new H-1B regulations that ultimately were struck down by the courts. But the idea of those regulations were to restrict H-1Bs to people who get the highest salaries. So that's something that we would be on the lookout for as well. and prevailing wages that are required for H-1B and E3 and H-1B1 visas, and also are applicable to perm labor certification cases. So those could pose difficulty for employers trying to sponsor their employees for those processes. The other thing is that for green card cases, during the last administration, Trump had instituted a public charge rule that was aimed to block low-income or disabled immigrants from getting their green cards. And for employment sponsor cases, that's not generally, a blocker, obviously, because they're getting, this foreign nationals are getting paid, but still kind of gummed up the process and added additional documentary requirements. So that's something that could be seen again. And then in terms of travel, I guess we are on the lookout for travel bans. This could be for countries that saw travel bans last time, like Chad, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Somalia, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen. And it could also be based on geopolitical conflicts as well. We don't know at this time, but overall, I think the idea is to, try to avoid international travel in the first half of 2025. That's something to think about, even if people have valid visas and travel documents.
Right. It is definitely something to consider. And when you talked about bringing back the public charge rule, the other thing that came to my mind is more likely than not bringing back the rule that they had under the prior Trump administration, which is to bring in all employment-based green card applicants for interviews at USCIS, which, as you mentioned, could gunk up the process and slow things down where it's been going rather quickly recently. It might slow it down significantly if we have to have all these interviews again with individuals.
Yeah, and that brings up a really good point for marriage-based cases. Currently under this administration, USCIS has been waiving most marriage-based interviews for green card cases, and that will likely be reintroduced again.
So I know you mentioned a little bit briefly about deference, the deference memo. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how that would have an impact on global mobility programs and just for individuals in general?
In the repeal of the deference memo, there will likely be more requests for evidence, potentially more denials. And so for HR and global mobility professionals, I would say budget, maybe additional cost for requests for evidence and to fight denials as well.
Yeah. So then, the other thing that has been on our minds is the Republican plan called Project 2025, which is the mandate for leadership, the conservative promise. And some of the key points that we've seen under that, which I know that Trump had kind of downplayed, but it's been, out there in the campaign with the literature, the information that's been discussed really goes and flows with Project 2025. And what we expect to see if some of those policies or ideas are actually implemented, it could result in making E-Verify mandatory and permanently authorize it, which would essentially, there's no cost to that program, but it would be an additional administrative cost for the organizations, to have individuals that are overseeing that program and making sure that it's running smoothly and in compliance. We could also see a merit-based immigration system created, which would award green cards to only those who are receiving the highest pay or the most educated. We also see from Project 2025 a plan to eliminate DACA, which would affect many employers and many organizations as well. And then there could also be an empowerment of the Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate, FDNS, which would put forth a veto power over approved H-1B petitions or other type of employment-based classification. So that's something that we're going to keep an eye on and do a little bit more research on. But from that respect, Miki, what can HR and global mobility do to prepare in the next few months before inauguration?
Yeah, I would say audit your employee population, and for people for whom there is a potential amendment that could be filed, maybe consider that for amendment/extension earlier than the 6-month window. I feel like, from now until inauguration day is an opportunity to push some cases through, especially those that are cases that could be scrutinized under Trump administration, right? And also, if there are national interest waiver cases that, people were planning to file because perm is taking so long, the window may be closing on national interest waivers. So for tougher cases like that, Global Mobility and HR might want to consider premium processing those cases. Remember that NIW cases take 45 days under premium processing. So to kind of factor that into.
Right. And so then I guess the other thing, right, is to do internal audits of the I-9 program to make sure that those I-9 forms are in order, but also other potential types of worksite compliance. Miki, what would you recommend in terms of those other programs that could be audited?
So now's a good time to make sure all your compliance files are in order, particularly things like the labor condition application, public access files, the perm audit files, just making sure that your compliance program is in order.
Yeah. And then one of the other things that we had talked about previously, and we're going to reiterate here as well, is, to have a litigation attorney on retainer. During, the prior Trump administration, businesses were suing. They were litigating over denied cases and delays, and it was very effective. So we're, again, recommending making sure that you take a look at having a litigation attorney. And also, as you mentioned, Miki, reopening those plans for the budgets to, increase the spend for immigration programs as there might be additional delays and potential litigation costs.
Totally agreed, Kim, because I think litigation is the way to keep the government accountable, especially if there is a denial that is completely, arbitrary and capricious. The courts are the way to make sure that the agency is following the law.
We are going to recommend, staying subscribed to our immigration updates. And then, Miki, can you sum up what some of the key takeaways are and strategies for our global mobility professionals going forward?
So file cases earlier if you can. Changes in employment that could be a trigger for amendments to file earlier in the window if you can. File national interest waiver cases or O1s if you can before the new administration takes over, and advising people who are nationals about the risks of international travel in early 2025.
Yep. And I guess one of the last things to do is to review the immigration program overall, but also the workforce. And if you have a workforce population that is comprised of individuals on TPS or DACA or some type of parole, such as Ukrainian parole program or the Afghan parole program, to just be aware of that and plan for potential disruptions in business operations.
I totally agree. Wise points.
Yeah. So I guess with that, it's a wrap for today's session. And we're going to keep everybody updated as we move, forward and closer to inauguration. So stay tuned with WR Immigration on our LinkedIn page, as well as on the LinkedIn profiles for me and Miki. And we're going to turn our Rapid Fire Wednesdays, as we always do, into newsletters so that you can, easily digest the information and the information as it comes to us and as we, provide that information to everyone. So thank you for tuning in and stay tuned. Thanks for your help, Miki.
Thanks, Kim.